I'm Andrew Newby. I've been working on an Academy of Finland project at the University of Helsinki since 2012 and it's finishing this year in 2017. It's just on different elements of the Finnish and Irish famines which occurred during the 19th century. This particular element of the project is looking at the way in which these famines were memorialised, and especially in the Finnish case. Well, in the Irish case, it's something, I'd say in general, it's something we all grow up with. We all grow up with this kind of awareness that there was a great famine in the 19th century, and it's had a big impact on the way in which Irish national identity has developed, and it's had a big impact on in the political sphere in Ireland. The main cause was the potato blight. Irish people were mainly depending upon potatoes for their calorific intake in the 19th century. One of the big points of contrast is that Ireland was ruled from London in the 1840s and for the entire 19th century. This has allowed a narrative to develop during which there's an argument that God sent the blight, but the British created the famine, which means really that, of course, there was a natural element to the disaster, but the way in which the British ruled Ireland contributed to the huge mortality at the time. In the Finnish case, the trigger was really the frost, the perpetual enemy of the Finnish people, which has been commemorated by the likes of Runeberg and so on, Coppelius. But in some respects you could also argue that this was a crisis which was developing over many years. The 1860s were a very hard time in terms of harvest failures in Finland, and the frost of September 1867 precipitated this disaster. Certainly it's a trigger, but it's maybe not the only cause. Well, in Ireland, especially since the 1990s, when Ireland had its 150th anniversary of the worst famine year, there's been a lot of memorials built. There were some existing already, but in Ireland, for example, there are memorials to the Great Famine in very prominent public spaces. In Ireland there's also a National Famine Museum in Strokestown in County Roscommon. Here in Finland it's very different, and yet at the same point of our history, I'd say after 150 years, there's probably as many famine memorials in Finland as there were in Ireland, very much conceived on a local level. So they're generally speaking in churches or nearby churches. They're often in the vicinity of mass graves. So it was maybe considered at a certain point that people remembered that these people were buried during the famine years, but they'd not been given a respectful burial. We've currently found over 80 local memorials in Finland, but I believe there's probably many more still to be found. It's a very big country, and new ones seem to be coming to light all the time. We're currently in Lahti, which actually is the largest town in Finland to have a memorial related to the famine years. And what's specific to this memorial and some of the other memorials in the close vicinity of Lahti, all of these memorials are in the vicinity of the St. Petersburg to Riihimäki railway. Now, the railway was developed in the 1860s. The financing of it was negotiated by the autonomous Finnish government with the authorities in St. Petersburg, partly as a famine relief work. So people were able to get famine relief as long as they worked on the railway. So charity in the circumstances of famine or hardship were often tied to a work task. And the railway construction, as with other parts of Finland, canal construction, for example, or forest clearance, it was tied to relief aid, usually in the form of food. So one commentator from ET, which is about 30 kilometres from here, spoke of the track being bleached by the dead bodies of those who'd worked on it. So very evocative memorialisation of these sites, especially linked to the railway construction. Well, I think it's important not to think there's a correct way to commemorate these kind of tragedies, these kind of catastrophes in a national history, but it's very interesting to be in Finland and look at this from an outside perspective and wonder why we remember things so differently in Ireland And one of the most obvious reasons, of course, is the fact that Finland was responsible for its own famine relief. One of the arguments made in Finland, actually, is that the very existence of these railways and canals were sufficient memorials to the deaths and the hard work of the generations that have gone before to help create the nation which emerged then in 1917, when full independence arrived. Certainly it was considered important in Finland that Finland should either stand or fail alone, but the fact that it was doing so alone without help from the imperial power was extremely important, and that's something which we don't really see in the Irish case. We are ruled from London. There's not really the ability in Ireland to make our own fiscal decisions, our own policy decisions, and yet the Finnish case does maybe teach us from an Irish point of view that in the circumstances where you have a Home Rule Parliament, it's not inevitable that famine will be avoided, depending on the decisions that are made in that Parliament. I think from my point of view, what's the most interesting thing is that is to learn about other countries, their reactions to famines at the time, but also the commemorations that have followed on from it. And I think that's a very interesting aspect of my own work.